Welcome back. So today we're going to do a little bit of an altitude seminar. Um, First thing you need to decide is what's the purpose? Are you seeking to perform at altitude, or are you seeking to benefit from training at altitude? And they're two different things. So perform at altitude, you need to be thinking about the altitude that you'll be racing at, and it's different depending on whether you're at moderate, high, or extreme altitude. And benefit from altitude, then for most of us, that would be training down at sea level. And then you need to be thinking about, wow, how am I going to put my training together so that at altitude, so that I don't wreck myself, so that I have a good camp. And then when I come down, I've benefited from both the camp and the altitude effect, and I'm able to perform. Now, for that aspect, on the main Endurance Essentials website, on the little tab that says ebook, you'll find a whole section written by John Hellemans about basically how to build an altitude camp. So where to go, what to do, how to taper in, how to taper out, how to monitor yourself, training progressions. The whole thing is in there for you. And that should be your first port of call. Read all that and do exactly what he says. That has helped hundreds of athletes and won multiple Olympic medals. The approach that John shares in that section of the ebook that we put together for you. Now, John is working on extending that into a print book, and when that's available, I'll make sure to tell you about it so you can get yourself a copy. It's really good advice. It's proven, and it's relatively conservative. It's not crazy or extreme, but you're going to benefit from it. Now, what I want to do is I want to talk about the different levels of altitude and your different options depending on where you are. Now, bearing in mind what we said in part one, which is ultimately it's the training that's going to drive the adaptations. So go to where you're going to have the best training and the fastest recovery. Going to altitude is going to slow our recovery initially, unless you happen to live at a moderate altitude. And that gives you many options. Whether you're going to go lower for a more intense block or a block where you want to recover quite quickly, or go a little bit higher to benefit. We're going to talk about how high might be too high in a few minutes. So let's just chat you through. So sea level. I lived in Christchurch, New Zealand, the South Island. Now in Christchurch, what are your options? Well, I had an altitude room. And basically what you do is you seal up a room fairly tight, plastic over the windows, plastic under the carpet, and you get oxygen concentrators and you blow the oxygen out of the room. So you create a low oxygen room. So the pressure in the room is sea level pressure, but the amount of oxygen as a percentage of the air is reduced. So if you're used to it, your body will adapt to this low oxygen environment. Now, I used it as my office as well as my bed. So I was in there quite a long time. So for these artificial altitude solutions, you need to spend quite a bit of time in them to get the benefit of it. Now, it moved my numbers a little bit, but one of the main benefits, I think, to living in a low oxygen environment, if you're mountaineering or if you're going to go to moderate or high altitude, is your body's already used to falling asleep in a lower oxygen situation. Now, that makes it really easy to continue to recover when you go to your altitude camp or you go to base camp. In the case of being a mountaineer. Because one of the challenges you're going to find if you go to high altitude, or if you're quite sensitive, you can go to moderate altitude, is you're going to find it difficult to sleep. And if you're not sleeping, you won't be recovering. And if you're not recovering, you're going to get tired really fast and kind of get run down. You're not going to get the benefits from the camp. So using artificial altitude in that way can be beneficial. Now, the other technique that we would use is we would do interval sessions. So we would go to the pool and we would do our swim workouts, say, and then afterwards we would do interval sessions where we were doing intermittent hypoxic training. So we would breathe low oxygen air. It would reduce the oxygen saturation in our blood. And then we would breathe regular air. It would come back up. And then we would breathe the low oxygen air. It would come down. So we would cycle up and down. John talks a little bit about that in his section, and I'm sure it'll be mentioned in the new book. So you can kind of check that out. My personal view on the intermittent is it didn't seem to do much for me, but there's decent science around it in terms of benefiting people, and particularly as an application in a healthcare setting, not in an endurance athlete setting. So if you're interested in that, that's something that's out there that you could dig into, learn a bit more about it in terms of health, asthmatics, other situations. Ask your doctor about it. They might have heard about it med school, or just read John's article and it'll give you a bit of a start on it. Now, moving up from sea level, let's say a lot of us will race, let's say 3,000 or 4,000 feet, and athletes will get kind of concerned. Oh, do I need to get, what about the altitude? Do I need to do anything special? I think St. George might be around, Utah might be around 4,000 feet. Penticton's, of course, I race well at. That's kind of like this low altitude type thing. There's no change really there. You won't notice any differences. I don't think there's any special preparation really required. Then we start getting up towards, say, 5,500 feet, 1,700 meters, 6,000 feet, 1,800 meters. Now we're starting to get into the moderate altitude range, and you will notice differences, particularly if you come straight up from sea level and then maybe go try and do a climb where you're going even higher. You will notice differences there. Now in Boulder, you get the benefit of living at altitude, so about 1,700 meters. It'd be nice if it was a touch higher, kind of in that 6,000 to 8,000 range, but it's not. But that does mean we have a bit more oxygen for doing some of our faster, more intense sessions. Now, the other thing that I experimented with in Boulder was using a low oxygen tent. So I would have my normal altitude, and then I would have an altitude tent, and I threw a mattress in there, and I would spend the summer sleeping in this altitude tent, and mountaineers use it. Same idea as what I explained with the room. Oxygen's being blown out. And what happens is you over the night, as the oxygen's kind of coming down, your effective altitude is increasing. And I used to find, it kind of worked. Again, I would start the night at a moderate altitude, and then the machine, after I fell asleep, would take the altitude higher across the night. Used it for one summer. I felt that it was better for me to train outside than to sleep high. I felt like the amount of training and the stress that I was under from the training side, I didn't need any more altitude stress. Now for training, my favorite altitude zone for training is between 6,000 and 9,000 feet. And I looked that up in meters, so that's 1,800 to 2,700 meters. And that band is easily accessed in Boulder and most of Colorado in the canyons or up higher. And there, I really like doing moderate tempo. And if you're a Nordic athlete, it would be what y'all call threshold, moderate threshold training. So it's kind of like that zone 3 training where we can do long intervals of moderate to moderately hard intensity, and we can absorb it. Now, what I found was that gave me a really useful endurance stimulus, meaning it made me very efficient in that range. And I have a hypothesis. I wasn't wearing oxygen saturation monitors. I didn't have OSAT numbers, but I think at the same time, I'm getting a mild to moderate hypoxic stimulus within my overall physiology. And I felt I really got a great bang for my buck on that. So that would be both riding long, moderate to moderately hard climbs, as well as running both steady and moderately hard at those altitudes. Now, as an older athlete, I'm doing my tempos down in boulders, so more like 1,700 meters. But when I was an elite, I would tolerate it up to about 2,000 meters, and it worked great for me. Particularly old railway grades, where you could kind of run steady up and then run moderately hard pace downhill, so you would get that pace work, but the heart rate would be down. It wouldn't be all that high. And elites talk about that effect, where when we're training at altitude, particularly when they come initially, they're getting more internal stress relative to the biomechanics stress. And what I mean by that is you'll notice when you come to altitude that your heart rate is elevated for the pace or the power. Pay attention to the heart rate. Don't ignore it. So use the heart rate, use your sea level heart rate zones. Don't try and hold those sea level powers when you arrive or those sea level paces, and know that you're getting an additional stress, but you're not getting more biomechanical stress. You're not getting more energetic stress. They talk about that. What we would find is that if we ignored that, we would get too much stress. We would get run down and it wouldn't work for us. So that 6 to 9 is what I call that kind of moderate to moderately high altitude zone. Really valuable. Now, we get to 9,000. 2,700 meters is roughly the max where I fall asleep no problem and have good sleep. I'm actually a little bit better, a bit lower down. So in the low 8,000s in terms of altitude. And I think it'll vary for most of us. I spent a summer training, and I rented a place up in Leadville. That's 10,300. So that's going to be about 3,000 meters. And I never adjusted to that Leadville altitude. I never was able to fall asleep easy and to stay asleep. My sleep quality always suffered. So if you find that there's an altitude where your sleep quality suffers, I would say straight up, it's too high. You'll need to find a lower place to do your altitude camp, because that sleep and that sleep quality is essential to getting positive adaptations. Otherwise, you're just going to be running yourself down, and there's no point in doing that. Likewise, your easy days, if you don't get out of altitude and get down low, you're not going to be adapting. So I would go up and down Boulder to Leadville that summer because I knew if I was at Leadville, I was getting run down. But what Leadville gave me was the ability to live and train at high altitude, because I was preparing for the LT 100 race on the bike. And that race runs between 9 and 13,000, actually 9 and 12,000 feet. On the other side of the valley in Leadville, it goes up above 13. If you're doing the runs, they do up to Mosquito Pass. And if you're training for an event that involves performing above 10,000 feet, 3,000 meters, my advice to you would be try to touch 12,000 feet as many times as possible in the summer before your event. So you don't need to be doing hard training, but you need to be going up to these extreme, very high altitudes in the United States, and as many different times. Because what I would find is early season, first time I touched 12,000, kick my butt. No matter how relaxed or moderate I thought I was being, I would come down and be like, wow, I was really tired. And I was tired from this big desaturation stress that I would get. But then as the season goes along, I would touch it more and it would take less and less out of me. And by the end of the summer, I'd be in a great position. I'd be able to ride tempo all the way up to those altitudes, come down, my heart rate would be coming down and be feeling great. Now in Colorado, you have the benefit of being able to do that in the winter as well. So you need to be thinking, if you're an athlete that wants to perform at those high altitudes, you can be thinking about throwing in some skimo and getting yourself up high across the winter, across the spring, so you just maintain those, we call it kind of like above tree line adaptations. And you don't need to be doing hard training. You just need to be getting up there, touching it with some skimo. So that's something to think about. Breck Epic, Leadville Stage Race, LT100, all that kind of stuff. Altitude, performing at altitude requires you to train at altitude. Sleeping in a tent at home is going to get you ready to maybe fall asleep when you're coming up to altitude, but it's not going to get you ready to perform. If you want to perform at altitude, you're going to need to train at those specific altitudes to get the benefits. The other thing you need to be aware of, as we move up in terms of altitude, our VO2 max is getting chopped. So if you are a low threshold, a low breakpoint athlete, what's going to happen is your ability to go anaerobic is going to become limited. This ability to surge into zone 5 and recover that you may have at sea level is going to be severely restricted the higher the altitude you go. So the higher your breakpoints, the better, particularly that first threshold breakpoint. The higher you can get that, it's much better, you'll find, at altitude, because this big engine, if you have one, is not going to be available to you when you get up high. It's going to even the playing field. So if you're someone with a moderately high VO2 max, but you're very well trained with high breakpoints, you can perform extremely well at altitude. And I was fortunate, being a slow twitch dominant athlete who trained a lot of volume, that I was very competitive in altitude situations. Whereas my friends who would absolutely crush me down in sea level, a lot of times they weren't able to access that part of their fitness once we got up, certainly once we were getting up around 12,000 feet. It starts to shift around tree line, 10, 11,000 feet. So something for you to kind of bear in mind for your race selection. What type of athlete are you? How do you like to race? Your substrate utilization will also change. A lot of people find that their fat oxidation isn't as good at altitude and they bonk easier. My experience is it's pretty similar. I think what happens is people don't realize that they're riding very intensely at altitude. And if they paid more attention to their heart rate, they would see that. But the science backs up that shift in substrate utilization. So that's something for you to consider as well. All right, altitude camp. We used to bring people into Boulder. We're at a moderate altitude, providing they didn't go bananas in the first few days at camp. They would be able to benefit from the overall camp experience. We would be able to take them up high. They would perform over the week, come down, and they'd be able to sleep. Again, providing they didn't smash themselves in the first 3 days. But if you really want to benefit from altitude and you're someone with a flexible schedule, I would recommend coming for 6 to 10 weeks. And that was always my approach to using Boulder and using Colorado to prepare for Ironman races, would be to try and come for 2 months, because that lets you settle in, do a number of training blocks, do some racing here, maybe do a camp up high, Winter Park or Vail, in that second month to really benefit from it, and then come down back to Boulder and then head off to your race. And I would usually go about 10 days out. And in Ironman Canada, I was able to find accommodation that was actually very similar altitude up in the mountains above Penticton. And so I would be able to continue just sleeping at my regular altitude and go down to sea level for my training during the day, and then do registration and all that. And it worked really well for me. It was cool, cooler up there, and it was really peaceful because there wasn't much going on. It was a ski area. So it's something for you to think about. It worked great for me. Now, if you have specific questions to altitude, got a lot of experience with this, just hit it up in the comments. I'm going to be pulling all of this stuff together into an article, which will eventually become a chapter in Endurance Essentials, and share that with you. So remember, key thing, decide, what am I trying to do? Am I trying to perform at altitude, or am I trying to benefit from an altitude training camp? If you're trying to benefit from an altitude training camp, your starting point is John's chapter and using these tips. The other thing, final thing, is you don't need to smash yourself at altitude. Altitude will give you the benefit by doing your normal training. And for your key sessions, focus on tempo, extended periods of tempo in that 6,000 to 9,000 range. I think you're going to find it does wonderful things to your late race endurance. Thanks for listening. Next up is going to be thoughts on humidity, that wet heat, very different than dry heat. I was racing in the dry heat last weekend, had a great time, was able to perform very well, keep myself cool. But in wet heat, all bets are off. We got to adjust things. We're going to talk about that next time. Thanks for listening.